She told him to move his boat or face fines. What she didn't know was he owned the entire lake they were standing on. Eric had always dreamed of living near a lake. For years he worked long hours, saved carefully, and waited patiently for the right property to come along. Then finally, after all that effort, he found a beautiful, quiet house tucked away beside a calm, peaceful lake. Wasn't in a big city or a crowded area. It was the kind of place where mornings began with birdsong, evenings ended with sunsets over the water, and peace filled the air in every direction. Eric was not a flashy person. He didn't throw parties, he didn't like drama, and he didn't need a lot of friends to feel happy. What he truly loved was nature, privacy, and the simple joy of being close to water. The lake was the biggest reason he bought that property. It came with a small wooden dock and just enough space to tie up his modest fishing boat, a clean, quiet little vessel he'd owned for years. Most days, Eric would wake up early, brew a cup of coffee, and step outside to sit on his dock. He would listen to the sounds of the lake, the water gently moving, frogs croaking from the far side, and sometimes the soft splash of a fish jumping out. It was his way of slowing down, of reminding himself that life didn't have to be a race. On some days, he would take his boat out for a slow ride, dropping a fishing line into the water and letting the world fall. Silent around him, the lake was everything to Eric. He kept it clean, respected the animals that lived near it, and stayed out of everyone's way. He didn't even mind when he saw a few neighbors from across the lake using it too. He believed in kindness and staying peaceful. So when he received a letter one morning, his calm world shifted. It was a plain white envelope slipped into his mailbox like any other. At first, he didn't think much of it. But when he opened it and started reading, his eyes widened. The letter was from the homeowners association known as the HOA. It said he was violating a rule by keeping his boat tied up to the dock behind his house. According to the letter, the boat didn't meet the community's aesthetic guidelines. The HOA gave him 10 days to move it or face fines $50 per day until it was gone. Eric sat down in disbelief. This wasn't just surprising, it was confusing. He had never received any rule book about this when he bought the property. He never signed anything agreeing that the HOA could control what he did on his own land. Besides, it was his dock, and the boat wasn't broken or ugly. It was clean and well kept. Why would anyone have a problem with it? Still, Eric didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. So the next day, he called the number listed on the letter and asked to speak to someone about it. A woman with a sharp tone answered. She said the HOA had received a complaint and that the rules applied to everyone equally. Eric politely asked where in the HOA rules it said he couldn't have a boat behind his house. She refused to explain further and just repeated the same line. "You are required to comply, or we will begin daily fines." That made no sense to Eric. He remembered the day he signed his papers with the real estate agent. No one had mentioned the HOA having any say over the lake or the dock. He even remembered asking about that exact issue, and being told the lake was special and different from the rest of the community. That memory was now bothering him. Something didn't add up. He pulled out the large folder where he had stored all the papers from when he bought the house. Mortgage documents, tax papers, and, most importantly, the property deed. Eric started reading it slowly, line by line, trying to make sense of the legal language. Then he saw something strange. There was a section labeled water rights. Most homebuyers ignore this part, but something made Eric look closer. It said, in clear terms, that the property purchase included exclusive rights to the body of water located within the outlined perimeter. Eric blinked. He owned part of the lake? Or did he own all of it? The more he read, the more clear it became. The previous owner, someone Eric had never met, had bought the land and the lake together decades ago. It was never handed over to the HOA. Instead, it had stayed private, passed down through a special sale agreement that kept the lake under private ownership, even though houses were later built around it. Eric felt his heartbeat quicken. If this was true, then not only did the HOA not have power over his boat, they didn't have power over any part of the lake. And if that was the case, then he wasn't the one breaking rules. They were the ones trespassing. Still, Eric didn't want to make mistakes, so he contacted a lawyer he trusted, a calm older man named Martin, who had helped him during the house purchase. Eric met Martin the next day in his office and showed him the letter from the HOA and then the deed. Martin read it carefully and nodded. "You're not imagining things," Martin said. "You own the lake. Every square inch of it within these property lines." Eric felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief because he wasn't in the wrong, frustration because the HOA was either careless or trying to bully him. Martin suggested they gather more documents, just to be safe, and then write a formal letter to the HOA explaining the situation. But Eric didn't want to jump into a fight. He decided to try one more time to talk to someone from the HOA and explain the truth. A few days later, he attended an open HOA meeting at the neighborhood clubhouse. It was the first time Eric had ever gone. The room was filled with people he didn't know, some friendly, some distant. At the front of the room stood a man named Greg, the HOA president. He wore a sharp suit and had a strong voice that made it clear he liked being in charge. Eric waited patiently for his turn, then calmly stepped forward. He told Greg about the letter. He explained what he had found in his property deed. Then he said something simple and clear. "I believe I own the lake. My deed includes water rights." Greg laughed. Not a kind laugh, but the kind that made others feel small, he said. "Everyone says that when they don't want to follow the rules." Eric didn't argue. He just handed Greg a copy of the deed and quietly said, "Please take a look before you fine me for something I didn't agree to." Greg didn't even look at the paper. He waved it away and said, "You have 6 days left to move that boat." Eric walked out of the meeting quietly, but inside, his mind was racing. He hadn't asked for trouble, hadn't started a fight. But if the HOA wouldn't listen, he was ready to stand his ground, because now he wasn't just defending a boat. He was defending the truth. Back at home that night, Eric sat by the lake, the soft wind brushing past his face. He looked at the water, calm and still, reflecting the stars above. This place was more than just land. It was his peace, his escape. And now it was being threatened by people who didn't even understand what they were trying to control. But Eric wasn't afraid. He had facts. He had proof. Soon, the HOA would have to learn a hard truth. They had picked the wrong person to push around. Eric didn't sleep much the night after the HOA meeting. His mind kept turning over everything that had happened. The letter, the phone call, the smirking president, and especially the way Greg had refused to even glance at the deed. Eric knew what he had found wasn't just an opinion. It was written proof, signed and legal, that he had full ownership of the lake behind his house. But despite having all the right documents, it still felt like he was the one under attack. Next morning, Eric went back to see Martin, his lawyer. This time, he brought everything: deeds, maps, sale agreements, old title records. They sat together at the long table in Martin's quiet office, the only sounds being the flipping of pages and the occasional clink of coffee mugs. Martin looked through each paper carefully, his eyes scanning the words with practiced focus. Then he leaned back and gave a slow nod. "There's no mistake," Martin said. The lake was purchased as private property by the original landowner. Back in the 1970s, when that owner sold to you, he included the lake in full water rights. It's not managed by the HOA, and it was never donated or handed over to them. Eric let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. So it was official. He didn't just own his dock or a corner of the water. He owned the whole lake. Continued, "This is actually rare. Most lakes inside neighborhoods like yours get handed over to the HOA or to a city. But in your case, the lake was kept as part of a private estate, was sold along with the house, almost like a package deal. You have clear legal ownership." Eric asked the obvious question. "Then why does the HOA think they can tell me what to do on it?" Martin shrugged. "Probably because no one ever told them otherwise. They assumed the lake belonged to the neighborhood. No one ever challenged them, and I'm guessing they've used the lake for events, fishing clubs, or parties for years without even checking the records." That was exactly what Eric had noticed in the months since he moved in. He'd often see people from the HOA setting up chairs along the lake's edge or organizing small fishing tournaments. There was even a floating dock on the far side with signs reading HOA use only. At the time, Eric had just thought they were being neighborly. But now, it looked like they were using private property without permission. Had been doing it for years. Martin suggested they take the next step draft, an official letter that clearly outlined Eric's ownership and asked the HOA to stop trying to regulate his use of the lake. He also recommended sending copies of the deed and legal map to every HOA board member, just so there would be no excuse for confusion. Over. The next 2 days, Eric worked with Martin to put everything together. The letter was written in simple, respectful language. It explained the property's history, quoted sections of the deed, and politely requested that the HOA immediately withdraw any threats or fines. Most importantly, it demanded they stop using the lake for events or fishing clubs until they had Eric's written permission. Eric had no desire to be mean or cause trouble. But he also knew this wasn't just about him anymore. The HOA had overstepped and they needed to know it. After sending the letters, Eric waited. For a few days, things were quiet. No new notices, no visits. But then, one morning, Eric noticed something strange. A group of people were gathered near the lake right in the area marked on the map as Eric's private property. They were setting up chairs, fishing gear, and a few coolers. It was a group from the HOA's fishing club. Greg, the president, stood at the center of it all, laughing with his arms crossed. He hadn't stopped anything. In fact, it looked like he was doubling down. Eric didn't want to start a scene, so he stayed back and watched. Later that day, he walked around to that side of the lake, found the exact boundary markers from the old map, and placed small wooden signs that read, "Private property, permission required." The next morning, those signs were gone. Torn up and left in the bushes nearby, Eric was now sure this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The HOA knew they had no legal control over the lake. But instead of apologizing, they were trying to intimidate him into giving up. So he called Martin again. This time they took a different approach. Martin contacted the county's property office and asked for the original surveys and title history of the lake. Within a few days, they had old maps showing that the lake had never been listed as public or community property. It had always remained under private ownership, even as houses were built around it. They also found something more interesting. Years ago, the previous owner had allowed the HOA to use the lake for a few events, but only through verbal permission. There was never any contract or agreement. It had all been casual, friendly handshakes, no paperwork. The HOA had gotten used to using the lake freely, and when ownership changed, they never asked for permission again. They just kept using it like it belonged to them. Eric was stunned. He now saw clearly how the problem had started. The HOA had gotten lazy, even arrogant. They assumed they owned the lake because no one had told them otherwise. And now that someone finally was telling them, they didn't want to believe it. Martin prepared a formal packet with everything they had found: maps, survey data, deed copies, legal interpretations. It was sent to the HOA with a final letter that said, "See Saul. Use of the lake immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action." Still, there was silence. Eric kept watching. Another weekend came. Once again, the fishing club showed up. Kids ran across the dock. Coolers were rolled in. Even a floating banner was put up, reading, "Annual HOA Lake Day, all residents welcome." Eric's blood boiled. It wasn't just about a boat anymore. These people were holding full-blown events on his land. Ignoring not just his words, but official legal documents, he walked out to the dock with a camera and took pictures of the signs of the club, of Greg laughing with a soda in hand. Everything was documented. Then Eric went back inside and called Martin again. This time, Martin told him they were ready to take legal steps. Before that happened, though, Eric wanted to give the HOA one last chance. He showed up at the next HOA board meeting, papers in hand, calm and serious. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood before the board and said, "I own the lake. I've proven that. With documents you've all received, do not have the right to use my property without my permission. If you continue to do so, I will take legal action. This is your final warning." Greg tried to laugh again, but this time no one joined in. A few of the board members looked down at the table. Others shifted in their chairs. The room was different. Now, tension had replaced arrogance. Eric handed each member another copy of the deed and left. Later that week, the first time since the letters were sent, no one came to the lake. The dock was quiet. The water was still. But Eric knew this wasn't the end. The HOA wasn't finished. And if they pushed again, he was ready. He didn't want to be in a fight. He didn't enjoy conflict. All he had ever wanted was to enjoy his peaceful lake, cast his fishing line, and listen to the soft wind move over the water. But if someone thought they could bully him out of his own rights, they were about to learn otherwise, because Eric was done asking. From now on, he would be telling. The tension had grown like a thick cloud over the neighborhood. Eric was not the kind of man who liked confrontation. He had spent his whole life avoiding trouble, choosing peace over arguments. But this time, the line had been crossed. The homeowners association wasn't just pushing rules. They were ignoring facts, disrespecting his rights, and pretending that nothing had changed, even after he had sent them legal proof. Even after his lawyer had explained the situation. They continued using his lake like it was theirs, and at the center of it all was Greg. The HOA president, Greg, was the kind of man who enjoyed power. He spoke loudly in meetings, wore expensive watches, and always acted like he was the smartest person in the room. People in the neighborhood often whispered about how controlling he could be, but most of them kept quiet to avoid problems. Now, Greg had finally met someone who wouldn't back down. Eric decided it was time to face him directly. He didn't want to be aggressive. He believed that the best way to solve problems was with calm and truth. But he also knew that silence wouldn't work anymore. Greg and his group were not going to listen to letters or quiet warnings. They needed to hear it face to face. So Eric sent an email to the HOA office requesting a private meeting with Greg. He didn't write a long explanation, just said he had something important to discuss about the lake situation, surprisingly. The response came quickly. Greg agreed to meet at the HOA office 2 days later. When Eric arrived, the office was quiet. A young woman at the front desk showed him into a small meeting room. Greg was already there, sitting behind a wide desk, a confident look on his face. He didn't stand up or shake hands. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "So you're the guy with the boat?" Eric nodded and sat down. "Yes, and I'm also the person who owns the lake." Greg chuckled. "We've been over this. The HOA manages the lake. It's in the community." "No," Eric said calmly. He pulled a folder from his bag and laid out the papers. "You've seen the deed. You've seen the legal maps. This lake was never part of the HOA's property. It was purchased separately and transferred to me. I have full ownership rights." Greg glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "Even if that's true, the community has been using the lake for years. That kind of history matters." Eric shook his head. "History doesn't change ownership. Just because you've used something for a long time doesn't make it yours. You were using it because the last owner allowed it. There was never a contract, never an agreement. Now you're using it without permission. That's trespassing." Greg leaned forward, his tone changing. "You really want to play hardball over a lake? Over a few boats and fishing tournaments?" Eric looked him in the eye. "It's not about boats. It's about respecting the truth. Tried to handle this quietly. I gave you every chance to fix it. You ignored me. Yes. You even tore down my signs. You're breaking the law, and I'm giving you one last chance to stop before I take this to court." Greg smirked. "You think the neighborhood is going to side with you? You think they'll care about some technicality?" Eric didn't raise his voice. He just said, "I'm not asking for anyone's side. I have the law on my side." The meeting ended with no agreement. Greg refused to back down. He acted like Eric was just another troublemaker trying to stir up problems. But Eric walked out of that room knowing one thing for sure: Greg was bluffing. He was confident only because no one had ever challenged him before. That was about to change. Eric met with Martin the next day. They talked about everything that had happened in the meeting, and Martin told him they were ready to take action. But Eric had one more idea before filing a lawsuit. He wanted to show the community the truth, so he printed copies of the deed, the property map, and the legal notices. He placed them in a simple folder and walked door to door, visiting the neighbors who lived around the lake. He wasn't rude. He wasn't trying to stir up anger, just said, "I thought you might want to know the truth about the lake." Some people were surprised. Others were embarrassed. They had assumed the HOA owned the lake too. Few admitted that they had. Felt something was wrong but didn't want to speak up. One older couple thanked Eric for finally standing up to Greg. They said he'd been bossing people around for years. That day changed everything. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People started talking. The fishing club that once met proudly on the lake now felt unsure. Parents who let their kids swim near the dock began asking questions. And most importantly, HOA members who once trusted Greg started to question his leadership. At the next monthly HOA meeting, something unexpected happened. More people showed up than ever before. The room was packed, standing room only. Eric didn't plan to speak, but when Greg tried to make an announcement about upcoming lake activities, someone from the crowd stood up and shouted, "Why are we still using a lake we don't own?"
Ouch.
Greg tried to dismiss the question, but more voices joined. He showed us the deed. You ignored legal letters. You lied to us. The meeting quickly turned into a mess. Greg tried to calm everyone down, but the damage was done. People had seen the truth for themselves. They weren't going to be silent anymore. A few days later, Eric received a letter at home. It was from one of the HOA board members, not Greg, but a quiet man named Samuel who had always stayed in the background. The letter said the board had scheduled a special vote to discuss Greg's leadership and the lake issue. It also said that several members now believed Eric was right and that the HOA needed to respect his ownership. Eric didn't celebrate. He wasn't doing this for power or revenge. But he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Still, Greg wasn't finished. Later that week, Eric found new signs placed near the lake. Community access, HOA, maintained area. Someone had also reinstalled the floating dock with a new banner reading Open Lake Day. It was a final act of defiance. Eric didn't waste time. Took photos again, called Martin, and this time they sent an official cease and desist. A letter, followed by a formal trespassing complaint filed with the local police. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't violent. It was just the law, finally being used the way it was meant to. When the HOA received notice of the complaint, the dock was quietly removed, the signs disappeared, and the next lake event canceled. Greg didn't speak much after that. Eric kept things simple. He repaired his signs, cleaned up the edge of the lake, and went back to his peaceful mornings on the dock. Neighbors now waved when they saw him. Some even stopped by to say thank you. A few kids asked if they could fish from his side of the lake, and Eric smiled and said, "Only if you ask first." He never stopped believing in kindness. But now he understood that sometimes you had to stand firm too. The lake was calm again. But now it was respected not just for its beauty, but for the quiet man who owned it and refused to be pushed aside. The morning air was still, and the surface of the lake shimmered under the early sun. Eric stood quietly at the edge of his dock, holding a cup of warm coffee in his hand. The lake, which had been the center of so much peace in his life, had also become the center of an unexpected storm. But now, for the first time in many weeks, there was a sense of silence, not just in the water, but in the community. It had taken effort, stress, and more courage than Eric thought he had. He was not a fighter by nature. He was someone who loved calm, privacy, and nature. He had only stood up because there was no other choice. The HOA had ignored him, mocked him, and continued using his lake even after knowing the truth. But now, after the legal notices and the trespassing complaints, the message had finally reached them. Greg, the HOA president who once acted untouchable, was now silent. The fishing club hadn't returned to the lake. The big banners were gone. No more floating docks. No more community events held on his private property. But the story didn't end there. Eric knew there was one last thing he had to do: take full control of the lake and protect it properly. Just sending letters and making complaints was not enough. If he didn't put clear signs, proper boundaries, and official rules in place, someone else might come along later and make the same mistake. And he wasn't going to fight the same battle again. So, Eric hired a land surveyor. This was someone who could come to the property with tools and GPS equipment to mark the exact legal boundaries of his lake. The surveyor walked around the shoreline, compared old maps with the real land, and hammered in small metal posts to show where Eric's property began and ended. Then Eric ordered custom signs, sturdy, weatherproof ones. They were polite but clear. Private property, at use by. Written permission only. He also placed a few signs near the usual entry points where HOA members used to come in. One near the path by the park, one near the neighborhood clubhouse trail, and one by the road where most of the fishing club parked their cars. Each sign had a small QR code that could be scanned to read the official deed and ownership documents online. Eric wanted full transparency. No one could say they didn't know. No one could say they weren't warned. Then he installed a small security camera near his dock. Not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to make sure no one came and removed the signs again, like before. One afternoon, as he was placing the last sign, he heard footsteps behind him, turned and saw Samuel, the quiet board member, who had sent him a respectful letter weeks ago. Samuel looked a little nervous but also calm, holding a notebook in his hand. "I wanted to talk," he said. Eric nodded and offered him a seat on a bench near the dock. Samuel explained that after. Eric had sent his legal complaints, and after the last HOA meeting turned into chaos. Several board members had held a private discussion. Many of them were tired of Greg's leadership. Some were afraid of lawsuits, and most of them now believed Eric was right. The papers were too clear. The HOA had no right over the lake. Greg had just been pretending to be in control. "Next week," Samuel said, "we're voting to remove Greg as HOA president." Eric didn't react with joy or celebration, just nodded and said, "It's the right thing." Samuel smiled a little. "We also wanted to ask if you'd be open to working with the community, not to give control of the lake, but maybe to create a permission system so people who respect your rules can still enjoy the lake with your approval." Eric thought for a moment. It was a good offer. He didn't hate his neighbors. In fact, some of them had supported him. He didn't mind people fishing or kayaking as long as they respected his ownership and asked first. "I'm open to that," Eric said, "but it will be on my terms. It has to be fair." Samuel nodded. "That's all we ask." The conversation ended well, and for the first time, Eric felt like the community was beginning to see him not as a problem, but as someone who simply wanted respect. A few days later, the HOA board held their special meeting. The vote was fast and final. Greg was removed as president by a large majority. Some residents clapped. Others looked relieved. Greg left the building without saying much, his face tight with anger, but he didn't fight back. His power had finally slipped away, not because of shouting or fighting, but because one quiet man had stood up with the truth. After that, things changed around the neighborhood. The fishing club officially disbanded. People began contacting Eric directly to ask if they could use the lake for small things, kids learning to fish, couples taking short kayak rides, or quiet early morning paddling. Eric created a simple permission form. It was free. He wasn't charging anyone. He just wanted a record of who was using the lake and when. That way, he could make sure it stayed peaceful and wasn't overused. He even set up a small website where people could request time slots to use the dock or borrow a corner of the lake for activities. The rules were clear: no large gatherings, no loud music, no garbage. Most people followed them happily, and those who didn't, Eric simply canceled their access. Over time, the lake became cleaner and quieter than ever. No more large crowds or noisy parties. Just the soft sound of paddles dipping into the water, the occasional splash of a fish, and laughter from kids who had permission to be there. Eric had turned what was once a source of conflict into a space of balance. Some neighbors even came to help him. One family helped plant native flowers along the shoreline. Another brought over a bench they had built. Few kids offered to clean up litter whenever they came by. Eric saw something he hadn't expected when people are shown respect and honesty. Many respond with kindness. The HOA, now under new leadership, changed its attitude. They focused more on helping the community and less on enforcing strict rules. The new president was someone more approachable. She even called Eric to thank him for being patient and handling things legally instead of creating fights. Eric appreciated that, but he didn't let his guard down completely. He kept the lake signs updated, made sure his lawyer stayed informed, and continued managing things with care. He had learned an important lesson: peace is worth protecting, but sometimes protection requires strength. One evening, Eric sat once again at the end of his dock. The sky was turning orange, and the lake glowed like melted gold. A young father walked by with his daughter, waving politely. They had signed up earlier that day to fish from the far corner of the lake. Eric waved back and smiled. He hadn't wanted a battle. He had only wanted peace. But sometimes, peace comes only after you take a stand. Sometimes you have to show people that kindness isn't weakness. And once you do, you don't just protect what's yours. You remind others what respect looks like. The lake was his. But now, it was more than that. It was safe. It was understood. It was whole. And Eric, the man who just wanted to fish in peace, had quietly changed the entire neighborhood. The sun was rising over the calm lake as Eric stood at the edge of his dock. The water was still, the sky soft with morning colors. This view, the one he had loved from the beginning, was finally his again, not just legally, but peacefully. After months of arguments, letters, meetings, and uncomfortable confrontations, Eric had one. But it wasn't a loud victory. There were no big announcements, no cheering crowds. It was quiet, and that's exactly how Eric liked it. The journey had not been easy. It started with one unfair letter from the HOA, trying to force him to move his boat. Then came the fight, a battle not of fists, but of papers, proof, and patience. Eric had been calm but strong, had never shouted, never acted in anger. He had stood his ground using truth and documents, showing that the lake belonged to him and that the HOA had no right to control it. Now, everything had changed. The signs around the lake clearly said it was private property. The HOA fishing club was gone. The new HOA leadership respected his rights. And more importantly, the neighbors had stopped seeing him as an outsider. Many of them now saw Eric as someone who had quietly protected what was fair, not just for himself, but for everyone. In the weeks after Greg, the old HOA president, was removed, the neighborhood slowly began to feel lighter. People no longer worried about surprise fines or unnecessary rules. The board meetings were now focused on real issues, repairs, community safety, and helpful improvements. And while Eric didn't join the HOA or attend every meeting, he was treated with respect. When he spoke, people listened. His actions had left a mark, not just legally, but personally. One afternoon, Eric received a knock at the door. It was a teenager named Lucas, holding a fishing pole. He nervously asked if he could fish at the lake with his younger brother. Eric smiled and said, "Yes," handing him a small permission slip and reminding him about the lake rules. No trash, no loud music, and no big groups. Lucas agreed happily and ran off. Moments like that reminded Eric why he had protected the lake in the first place. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about balance, about keeping something beautiful safe, not locked away, but respected. Over time, more people started following the process. They would email or knock on his door politely, asking if they could borrow a kayak or fish on weekends. Eric welcomed those who respected the rules and the land. He wasn't trying to shut people out. He was only asking them to understand that the lake was not public property, and that respect mattered. Some neighbors even began volunteering to help him maintain the lake. One elderly couple brought over some water plants to improve the ecosystem. A group of kids offered to help clean the shoreline every month. Others simply walked by and waved, saying thank you for what he had done. For someone who never sought attention, Eric was surprised at how many people now appreciated him. One day, the new HOA president, a kind woman named Angela, invited Eric for tea. They sat on her back porch, overlooking the community garden. "I just wanted to thank you again," Angela said. "Most people wouldn't have handled this as peacefully as you did. You had every right to be angry." Eric shook his head. "I wasn't angry, just tired of being ignored." Angela nodded. "Well, you've made a big difference." The board has decided to officially update the HOA documents. From now on, the lake will be marked as private property on all maps and documents. And no more events will be planned around it unless you give written permission. Eric appreciated that. It wasn't just about his rights anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. The new rules would protect future homeowners too, so the lake wouldn't become a problem again. As the months passed, the lake continued to thrive. The water stayed clean, the birds and fish returned in greater numbers, and the once chaotic atmosphere was replaced by quiet joy. Eric built a small bench on the far end of the lake where visitors could sit. It was a simple wooden bench with a small plaque on it that read, "Respect and Peace." It wasn't a statement of victory. It was a reminder for everyone then. Something unexpected happened. One evening, Eric saw a familiar figure walking toward him from across the lawn near the lake. It was Greg, the same Greg who had tried to bully him, ignored his documents, and led the HOA with arrogance. Greg looked different now, less confident, quieter. His eyes didn't carry that same sharp pride. He stopped a few feet away and said, "Do you have a minute?" Eric stayed seated on the dock, nodded, and gestured for him to sit. Greg let out a slow breath. "I was wrong. I didn't handle things well. I let my ego get in the way." Eric didn't say anything. Greg continued, "You didn't deserve the way I treated you. I thought I was protecting the community, but really I was just protecting my own control." There was silence for a few moments. Then Eric said, "Thank you for saying that." Greg looked out at the lake. "It's beautiful. Always has been. I just didn't realize it wasn't ours to control." Eric nodded. "It can still be shared, just with permission and respect." Greg nodded slowly, then stood up. "Take care, Eric." Eric didn't know if the apology was enough to make up for the months of stress, but he knew it took courage to say it. And for a man like Greg, even showing up and admitting fault was a big step. In the years that followed, Eric remained the quiet guardian of the lake. He didn't change. Still woke up early to drink coffee by the water. He still went fishing. Alone, enjoying the sound of the breeze moving across the surface. But now, he wasn't alone in protecting it. The community had changed. People were more aware, more respectful, more connected. The lake had become something special, not because it belonged to everyone, but because everyone understood its value. It wasn't just a piece of water behind some houses. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right doesn't always require shouting or fighting. Sometimes it just takes patience, proof, and persistence. Eric never told this story to many people. He didn't need to. Those who had watched it unfold already knew what had happened. And those who came later knew families, knew neighbors only. Saw a peaceful lake and a kind man who welcomed them with a smile and clear rules. But deep down, Eric carried the memory of every letter, every meeting, and every silent moment when he could have given up but didn't. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a boat. It was about one man, one lake. And the power of standing calmly but firmly when the world tries to push you aside. And in that quiet victory, Eric found something more meaningful than winning. He found peace. Real peace. The kind that stays.